Hello everyone, good evening. At the moment it looks like it's just fossil-free SA here. Kim, welcome. Okay, it's 28 minutes to 8 and I'm going to get started. I was hoping that this would be streamable to Facebook, but that's not actually working, which is rather disappointing. Please forgive me for seeming a little scatty this evening. I'm quite sick and I was actually worried that I had COVID, but the test came back negative today. So in the hopes that this is getting out to someone somewhere, I'm going to get started. I'm just checking that there's an option for recording this. Okay. Right. So Fossil-Free South Africa is a campaign that's 7 years old, 8 years old actually now. We started as an effort to get the University of Cape Town to stop investing in fossil fuels. And we've become a national campaign trying to establish the principle that it is crazy to be investing in the problem of climate change when we should be investing in the solutions for it. I just want to dive quickly into a graph that I found just earlier today. This is from the International Renewable Energy Agency, showing the returns on investments from old and new energy over the last year. At the bottom of the graph, you see 30 minus 37% from the S&P 500 Energy Index, and 100 plus 138% from the S&P Global Clean Energy Index. So in some ways, it's almost weird under the circumstances that we're still having this discussion. But let's get on and pick through it. So the same report, which came out a couple of days ago, states very clearly that renewable energy production needs to grow 8 times faster than the current rate to help limit global heating, according to a report. And that report is from the International Renewable Energy Agency, saying $131 trillion in investments needed over in renewables. And the target that we're shooting for here is the target of meeting the target set in Paris in 2015 for limiting global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade by the end of this current century. And the problem that we face is that despite everything that we hear about climate change, most of the world, including South Africa, is still on track for a possible 3 to 4 degrees of warming globally, which means in Central and Southern Africa, 6 to 8 degrees of warming for our region. So very briefly, our story, we've been going for a few years. We've been working on trying to persuade asset managers to establish fossil-free funds. We've worked together with the Principles for Responsible Investment holding retirement funds in 2019. This is our second campaign focusing on asset managers. Our 2018 Spotlight campaign tried to do the same thing in more general terms. So as you probably are aware, since you're here this evening, climate change is the greatest, most pervasive threat to the natural environment and human rights of our time. And essentially what we need to do at the moment to prevent warming beyond 1.5 degrees, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 7.6% every year. That number has gone up now because that estimate came 2 years ago in 2019. Every year that we delay action, the amount of time that we have to cut emissions in order to meet the 1.5 degree target decreases. So in this current graph here, you see the blue line, which is an indication of these lines show our current emissions, and the blue line indicates the rate at which we need to cut those emissions if we want to have a chance of reaching 1.5 degrees. So the main reason why we're running this campaign in a sense is divestment at a small scale doesn't have an impact on the economics of fossil fuel companies. But what it does start to do is send a clear social signal that it's no longer acceptable to be investing money in something that is so dangerous for humanity. So I'm going to go through some of the evidence that we are, in fact, in some ways in worse shape than we hoped we might be, and in other ways we're in better shape. But one of the problems that we face is that scientists by nature are extremely cautious people, and especially when science becomes controversial, as climate science has become controversial, they become even more cautious. And the result is that in many respects we find that the evidence of global warming and climate change going past the expectations of scientists. You may be familiar with this graph. What you're looking at here is the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This graph shows the last 800,000 years, but going back over the past 3 million years, the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have not exceeded 300 parts per million. And then in our very own lifetimes, on May 2013, for the first time, we pushed those part levels of carbon dioxide over 400 parts per million. And that doesn't include the impact of other greenhouse gases that we're emitting, such as methane from natural gas extraction and hydrofluorocarbons from refrigeration, which are many greenhouse gases, many thousands of times more potent than carbon dioxide. So if we want to go back in geological time to find an equivalent event to the geological event we're creating for our world, we have to go back nearly 60 million years to something called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. What you're looking at in this graph, the blue line indicates the pace of change during that geological event, and the red line indicates the pace of change that we're imposing on the planet at the moment. And on the left, you can see itemized some of the consequences of that transition, which I hope makes it fairly clear that we really need to try and avoid the fate that we're lining up for ourselves. I'm going to skip through some of these headlines. I think the gist of them is fairly clear. one of the problems that we face is that the Amazon jungle, which is a part of the world which is a natural carbon sink, which until recently has sucked up large amounts of the surplus carbon dioxide that humanity is producing, is now in danger, not only from drying trends, but from deforestation trends of tipping into being a savanna-type ecosystem, which has far less potential for storing carbon. And in the last year, what we've learned from climate scientists is that the Earth's climate is more sensitive rather than less sensitive to increases in carbon dioxide, as some had hoped. And we face this problem in the context of many other parallel ecological crises, South Africa being one of the countries most vulnerable to ecosystem collapse. Now, the Earth system and our environment and our economies and our societies amount to being an extremely complex system, and in complex systems, predicting what's going to happen when unexpected change starts to come upon us is very difficult. But what we are starting to understand is that economists have probably systematically underestimated the likely costs of climate breakdown, which means that people have said that it's more expensive to change than it actually really is. But what we're now starting to see is figures like the UK Environment Agency saying our thinking needs to change faster than the climate. And these consequences are starting to, what we thought was going to be a future problem, the consequences are getting very, very close, very, very fast. So one consequence being, for example, that many Australians now are going to be unable to get household insurance because of the risk of fire in the regions in which they live. So all these risks in total have been summarized by the editor of The Guardian as saying that we face potentially the downfall of the civilized world, perhaps in the lifetime of today's school children. And that is within the next 60 to 80 years. We're not looking at the extinction of humanity, but we are looking at very, very large-scale threats to the kind of stable, relatively stable global society that we take for granted at the moment. Again, looking at the problem that we face, and this is from this report that came out in the last couple of days, the yellow line on the graph shows the current likely trajectory of planned carbon dioxide emissions, which are far in excess of the cuts that are actually needed, indicated by the blue line. So I thought I'd dive down briefly into the history of our atmosphere, which is quite interesting. This is what Earth may have looked like 2.5 to 4 billion years ago. And at that stage, our atmosphere was a combination of probably, and this is all quite speculative science, but large amounts of nitrogen, methane, ammonia, carbon dioxide. And it's really in large part processes of life and that have captured carbon dioxide over the course of biological history. So if you look in this graph, where the yellow area shows you the extremely high amounts of carbon dioxide that were in the Earth's atmosphere historically, and how those were brought down. And they were essentially brought down by being captured by living organisms. And they remain captured in the Earth's crust in the form of limestone and fossil fuels, coal, gas, and oil. And the vertical line that runs through the graph at the end, that shows the small portion of Earth's atmospheric history during which we've had an atmosphere resembling what we're accustomed to today. That is mostly nitrogen and a small portion of 20% oxygen, and much smaller portions of other gases such as carbon dioxide and water vapor. So our modern atmosphere gives us a world that looks like this. And this is the atmosphere that we want to preserve. But we're pushing up carbon dioxide. We're bringing down oxygen. They're not yet to significant levels, but one of the ways that the impact of climate change can be measured is that, of course, when you burn fossil fuels, you consume oxygen. and there are impacts on oxygen levels that are measurable to human activity. We can put this in human terms, the scenarios that we face. This is the temperature curves that we're looking at projected ahead. This is from an Australian scientist called Sophie Lewis. She was born in 1982. Her daughter was born in 2017, the yellow area. She expects her child will finish high school in 2035. And if we continue along the current emission scenarios that we are, the highest line here is a bit steeper than we're currently on, but we're sort of probably looking at the bottom of the red zone and on current emission scenarios. This is the world we're heading into. So I thought I'd step back and take a look at some of the contexts for this problem, some of the causes of the crisis that we find ourselves in, some of the concepts and underlying problems that we have in society that lead us to continue on this apparently insane path. One of these is arguably our obsession with gross domestic product and the idea that net production by society is somehow a measure of human economic well-being. But in fact, the GDP was not conceived as a measure of national well-being. And one of its originators, Simon Kuznets, an economist, said goals for more growth should specify more growth of what and for what. So another problem that we have in society is that all our activities have effects at various different levels, and some of those costs, the costs of those effects, we bear personally, but many others we don't. So take driving to work, for example. We pay the cost of our petrol, we pay the cost of buying a car, but we don't pay the costs of pollution, we don't pay the costs of risks of accidents, we don't pay the costs of congestion. Those are externalized costs. And as a global economy, we've had many externalized costs that we are not properly accounting for. This is a very powerful quote from John Robert F. Kennedy from 1968, in which he explained quite clearly the tremendous shortcomings of trying to understand human and economic progress through the very narrow lens of gross domestic product. So I talked earlier about the transition that we went through in 2013, a sort of civilizational impact on geological time. But we went through another little understood transition in the early 1970s, which is the point at which the net externalities of human civilization began to exceed the limits of our environment and economy. And we've gone into ecological overshoot. It's a bit like if you are somebody who has an endowment, you live for a while on the income from that endowment, but at a certain point, your costs start to increase and you start eating away at the capital on that endowment, and you start to gradually run down the endowment on which you are dependent. In our case, the endowment that we have is the tremendous riches and treasures of the earth we live on. When we go into overshoot, we start to destroy our natural capital and the ability of natural systems to regenerate themselves. We destroy whole ecosystems and species. Fortunately, many modern corporations are starting to understand that countries around the world depend on vital natural services to maintain the health and stability of communities and economies. The environment is the foundation of the economy. That's all too little understood and appreciated. Here in South Africa, at the moment, we exceed the biological capacity of our country by around 3 times. So what does this look like if you take this lens and apply it to a single company? A company which is kind of a flashpoint for these issues in South Africa and investment, because most investment managers want to include Sasol in a portfolio. And Sasol had 2019 annual revenues of 200 billion rand. Their earnings on those revenues were 6 billion rand. But we can calculate the climate damage that was done by Sasol in 2019 at 60 billion rand, and that's a conservative estimate. that's using less than the estimate that ExxonMobil, a fossil fuel company, puts on its own internal ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And of course, this doesn't include the other damages that are done by Sasol from its nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide pollution. And we know that there are probably thousands of people who die every year as a consequence of Sasol's other emissions. There are various different ways to constrain these damaging externalities. One way is to outlaw them. So in the 1980s, we successfully, as humanity, managed to outlaw the use of chlorofluorocarbons, refrigerants that were destroying the ozone layer that protects us from UV light. You can regulate to manage these emissions. You can tax the externality, carbon taxes one way or the others, or you can use and subsidize the development of less damaging alternatives. In a case of fossil fuels, for example, that's obviously renewable energy. And the cost of renewable energy, happily, is declining very, 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 very fast. So the red line that descends through this graph shows that in the past 10 years, the levelized cost of solar energy has dropped 89%, from $359 a megawatt hour to $40 a megawatt hour. And the costs of onshore wind have dropped 70%. In the same time, the cost of coal has dropped only 2%, and the cost of nuclear has increased 26%. But facing these trends, it's a mystery why our Department of Energy would still advocate for coal and nuclear. Again, if you look at the safety and damage that is done by different sources of energy, you can see that coal and oil and natural gas are by far the most dangerous in their overall impacts. Nuclear is down at the bottom here as being apparently a safer form of energy. But of course, what it doesn't count into what's not reckoned here for nuclear are the displacements of human populations that have followed accidents and disasters like Chernobyl and Fukushima. What if we turned away from fossil fuels in South Africa? What would the impact be on employment? Well, there are a whole range of studies that have been done. This one particular study estimates that we would create a net 145,000 jobs by 2050. And again, a more general trend, this is from McKinsey & Company, looking at how spending after the pandemic can start to create jobs. What they show clearly is that spending money on renewable energies and energy efficiency creates far more jobs than spending money on coal, gas, and oil. So if we want to build a better society for people, we have a much better chance of doing that through investment in renewable energy. So there's another trend that we're facing at the moment, which is that fossil fuel companies, the likes of BP and Shell, are increasingly saying, after years of denying the danger of climate change, now what they're saying is, well, we're going to shoot for a net zero target in 2050. And what they mean by that is that by that date, they hope to have reduced their production of fossil fuels and increased their ability to store carbon dioxide so that the net impact of their operations is zero carbon dioxide. The problem with 2030 is that 2050 as a target is that's an awfully long time away. As I showed earlier, we really need to cut carbon dioxide very steeply by 2030. And so what's important is that companies do not just give us targets for over the next 30 years, which means that they essentially defer accountability by a very long time, but that they also start to set year-by-year targets and demonstrate that they can make science-based cuts in the very, very short term as well as the long term. And it's not just advocating for us, saying that this is being pointed out by some very influential people in the asset management industry. You would think, as I mentioned earlier, given that all we are hearing about climate, that we would be doing enough about it. Unfortunately, the fact is that we aren't. We are at present headed to between 3 and 4 degrees of warming by 2100, despite the Paris target that was set 6 years ago. Donald Trump is notorious for having withdrawn the United States from the Paris Agreement, but in fact there is not a single country, not one, that is actually meeting the requirements of the Paris Treaty in the targets that they are setting. So if you look at the Climate Change Performance Index, which is one measure of progress on climate change, the compilers of this index won't even put any countries into the top 3 positions on this index because nobody essentially is doing enough yet. The implications of this are, of course, amongst many others, that the oil and gas industry will need to scale back much, much faster to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So how do we make sense of this situation of dangerous inaction that we face? And I think some of the reasons are that we have enormous institutional inertia. We have built an energy system over 200 years, which is designed to do one particular thing, and our infrastructure is designed for all that. There are immense vested interests, and the fossil fuel industry is also enormously corrupt in many ways, probably second only to the arms industry in its levels of corruption. And that fossil fuel industry has deliberately and systematically financed large disinformation campaigns to try and create public confusion over the impacts of climate change, and they've been very successful in doing that. But one of the other problems that we have is a largely amoral financial sector, which until very recently has focused almost entirely on short-term financial returns and has not taken into account the long-term consequences of the investments it's making. So if we dig back through the history of systematic denial, we see that the oil and gas industry has used the same tactics and same resources as the tobacco industry did in order to create doubts about the science of climate change, just as was previously done in respect to tobacco. Again, all big fossil fuel groups failing to meet their climate goals. This is from October last year. I'm going to skip through some of these points. This is another picture of this Oil Change International report from 6 months ago, showing that of the 8 largest integrated oil and fossil gas companies in the world, none come close to aligning their actions with the Paris Agreement. And this is 6 years after that agreement was created. Here in South Africa, we often hear our president making quite progressive statements on climate change. Unfortunately, we also hear a great deal of enthusiasm about natural gas, and a great deal of continuing interest in supporting fossil fuel developments, such as this vast new special economic zone that is planned for Limpopo, that would include a 3 gigawatt coal power plant that would completely blow our climate targets out of the water, and our credibility in international negotiations are with it. This is all rather short-sighted because the evidence is that new renewables will be cheaper than existing coal in South Africa from 2027. In other words, it will be cheaper to just throw away Eskom's existing infrastructure and build new renewables rather than to keep throwing money at maintaining the existing infrastructure. So we have climate policy in South Africa, but we don't have climate leadership. There's another way of looking at the problem of that we're approaching through divestment, which is to show that if we took the full reserves of oil, gas, and coal companies and turned them into carbon dioxide, which is essentially their business model, we would far, far, far exceed what is permissible under international climate targets. And when the world finally comes firmly to that conclusion, the danger is that we will have a carbon bubble that will have a very major impact on the global economy, just as we've had other bubbles, such as those in the internet industry and property in 2008. So the global divestment movement now encompasses around $14 trillion in assets. That's the total value of the funds that have to divest, and not the amount that's been divested from fossil fuels. Many of these organizations are faith-based, many are philanthropic, many are educational. The movement's really started on North American campuses, but there are increasing numbers of pension funds and for-profit corporations coming through as well. Invest from them. But the fact is that there is an enormous amount of evidence that while shareholder engagement can be useful in getting companies to change some aspects of their business models, there's very little evidence that it helps to change their core business model. And when it comes to Sasol and Alan Gray, for example, if Alan Gray was sincere in their attempts to engage with Sasol over climate change, they really should have started that in 1992 when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed. Instead, they left it for 25 years before very recently, in a very haphazard and half-hearted way, starting to talk about these issues. One of the emerging trends that we have in investing is something called ESG, which means to try and tilt investment priorities towards companies that show greater regard to environmental, social, and governance concerns. This is a positive trend. It definitely helps, but many ESG scores are not yet sufficiently aligned with actual science-based targets to make the kinds of impacts that we need at the speed that we need them. So I'm just going to skip through here. This is more about the limits of shareholder action. To some extent, the whole discussion about divestment versus engagement is a bit of a false choice, because it is possible to both partially divest and to continue engaging if you really, really believe that you have an impact through engagement. People often worry that we will lose money if we divest from fossil fuels. I showed you at the beginning of this evening's presentation the slide showing the returns on investments on renewable energy over the past year. I would think that would be sufficient evidence, but there's quite a lot of other evidence that it's very foolish to invest in the end of the world when you could be investing in a more sustainable future. But there have been a number of studies which bring up the same result over and over again, that investment in sustainability, even in the relatively limited form that is being proposed at the moment, still brings equivalent or somewhat better returns than investing by conventional standards. Here, for example, is a study from an institution in the United States that surveyed 200 philanthropies a few years after they divested, and the vast majority said that their financial performance had since taken the pledge had been either positively or neutrally affected. So I mentioned at the beginning of this evening's presentation that divestment is often misunderstood. Particularly people from the financial services industry imagine that divestment is primarily intended as a financial lever, as a way of impacting the cost of capital for oil, gas, and coal companies. It can work that way at scale, but at a small initial level, it is far, far, far more important as a social and moral movement, and movement in which we start to accept our personal and individual and collective responsibility for creating climate change and undertake to do something about it. one way of thinking about it is that renewable energy is part of changing the energy infrastructure of society, but divestment is about changing the social, cultural, intellectual, and financial infrastructure of society. And here in South Africa, this has particular resonance for us because one of the ways in which apartheid was pushed out of our country was that the international pressures assembled through an international divestment movement had a very, very powerful effect on the international conversation around the acceptability of, or the unacceptability of apartheid. And those who argue that the divestment movement had no impact sort of point to its admittedly limited financial impacts and say, well, it didn't really have an effect. But what it did have an effect at was as a level of social discourse. And here we see that many institutions were pushed through their being forced to make a decision about divestment to say this is no longer acceptable, that South Africa should govern its people in the awful way that it was at the time. So here's a summary from a statement on divestment, a study on divestment saying the outcome of the stigmatization process poses the most far-reaching threats to fossil fuel companies. Direct impacts pale in comparison. So again, it's very important for us to start divesting from fossil fuels as fast as we possibly can, given the limitations of the course that we're on at the moment, that we're falling far short of what were the targets that we need to be meeting. It's incredibly important that we don't spend a moment putting our money into the problem when we should be putting it into the solution in ever greater quantities and amounts. So our campaign, as you probably are aware, is that we're sending letters to the top asset managers in South Africa, asking them to create fossil fuel investments now. There is now one fossil-free fund in South Africa. It's called the BCI ESG Equity Fund. It's an existing fund that has been given a sharply different mandate as of the beginning of this year. It is now based on an S&P ESG index. That S&P ESG index automatically screens out most fossil fuel companies, but for some bizarre reason doesn't screen out Sasol. So the managers of this fund, this BCI ESG equity fund, have put an additional screen on Sasol to ensure that it is not included in this index, and this BCI ESG equity fund is now the closest thing that we know of to a truly fossil-free fund in South Africa. So, great, I see there are some people here still have been speaking entirely into a void. I must apologize, the use of this platform is somewhat experimental, and I was hoping to be able to hear from and see from you more than I have been, but I can read your questions in the text box, so please, if you have questions at this point, shoot them through and I'll do my best to answer them. I can see James, Jeff, Carola, Jonathan. Yeah. Any questions at this point? Okay, so Glenn has asked about the the BCI fund. Yes, individuals can invest in it. We're right in the middle of, at this particular moment, of getting the the details of where and how that fund can be invested in. I'm hoping to get a fund fact sheet from the managers of the fund within the next few days, and individuals can definitely invest in it. Kim has asked about the military-industrial complex, and I just want to see if I can find a particular graph at the moment. What the S&P index, the underlying S&P index that the fund is based on, is really has some initial exclusions before it even starts tilting the playing field away from carbon and so forth. And I think in this case, that those exclusions include certain categories of armaments and nuclear. I'm just trying to see if I can find that. Where did I put that graph? I can definitely answer that question, but there is actually quite a heartening list of initial exclusions on that list. So although those in many respects don't apply to South Africa, I don't think Denel, which is our one major arms company in South Africa, is listed on the JSE. If you have any thoughts about this particular platform, including that perhaps that you might hate it, feel free to let me know. I was hoping to be able to see you, and I can't, so that's rather frustrating for me. I think we'll probably go back to Zoom for the next one, and thank you for bearing with us in five signatories across all the different letters, and the majority of those have been been signatories in respect of Alan Gray. So we're about halfway towards our target of 89 signatures for our letter for Alan Gray. Jeff asked if this is recorded. I think, I hope it has been, but I will repeat this presentation again with a slightly more reliable technological back end, Jeff, so that we can pass it on to others. We're going to be running this campaign for a while still. James, you asked about the UCT campaign. As many of you know, we are trying to persuade the University of Cape Town to divest. We had our third vote passed at the convocation in December in favour of divestment. So that's 3 votes now by convocation, which is the body representing all alumni and academic staff. And of course, many other indications of support. During convocation in December, the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Bakeng, indicated quite clearly in public that she personally supports the principle of divestment, and that in some ways it's now a matter of time for the university to kind of take that principle and turn it into an actual institutional commitment. In 2 days' time, Thursday this week, at the invitation of the Vice-Chancellor, I'm going to be doing a presentation very similar to this one to the UCT leadership Lekgotle, so to an array of senior staff at the university, and it's going to be framed in a sense as a debate between us and others who, in theory, oppose divestment, but who don't really, just have a slightly different take on how the question is phrased. Kim asking about investments in PV systems. I think you may be thinking of the Sun Exchange, Kim, which is a great platform for investing in renewable energy and solar. I've been tracking the Sun Exchange for several years. I think they're pretty reputable. I have an investment through them myself, with the very first array that they built at the Stellenbosch Waldorf School, and I recently got an email from them saying that the returns on that were not as good as they had projected, and that they are completely revamping that installation so that hopefully that the output from that will be improved. So yeah, but we have this one BCI ESG fund that has been produced that's fossil free, and we need to get more out now from other institutions, and to start breaking the social consensus that it's still okay to be investing in fossil fuels. So I'm going to say good night to everyone. Thank you very much for bearing with me, and we'll chat again soon by newsletter and email. Thank you again. Good night, everyone.